Hello, everyone. A super exciting episode today. We have Sasan Kasravi here with us. He is probably best known for running the Proteus Debate channel with his co-host Paul, and they make some great videos. I will link their channel down below in the description. You should go watch them. I was just telling Sasan that I sort of grew up in PF watching their videos because I think they're super, super helpful. But also there's much more to Sasan than just Proteus. So I have some questions about you to do a bit more of an in-depth introduction. So my first question is, can you tell us
Real quick, before we
about,
get into the first question, thank you for having me. I already said all of this to you right before the video, but let the record show I'm grateful to be here. Excited. I'm
I
ready for the
appreciate
first
it.
question.
I'm grateful for you coming as well. But yeah, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Okay, first question then for you. Can you tell us a little bit about your like debate experience as a competitor and then also your transition to starting to coach debate?
Yeah, I didn't have debate at my high school. Years later, I helped one of my old English teachers start that debate team, and they just won a like Parley like sweepstakes award for their league. So like that, I mean, they've come a long way, and I'm very proud of them. But I didn't have the opportunity to debate while I was in high school, and I don't know that I would have done it. I ended up in debate in the community college that I went to, Diablo Valley College. Go Vikings! And I didn't really have a lot else I was doing, so that came at a good place for me. And I ended up really liking it and doing fairly well. So at community college, you're competing for most of the year against regular colleges and regular tournaments, but at the end of the year, they have a community college only state championships and community college only national championships. And those are the only tournaments that I really did well at, partly because in Parley, those tournaments were you could only prep yourself. You didn't have like coach prep. And I didn't really have a debate coach that knew a lot about debate or was very involved. And yeah, I had to figure out a lot of stuff in debate on my own. But I did fairly well. I won a state championship, got silver a bunch of times. And my second year as a competitor, maybe my third, I don't know. It was weird because I skipped semesters, right? I did 4 semesters, but across started in the spring. It's all confusing. But this kid Paul joined the team, and we became friends. And I sort of started mentoring him and teaching him debate, and that was sort of how I started coaching. And after my final time going to the state and national championship, I was not out of eligibility broadly speaking, but I was out of eligibility for community college debate.
Mhm.
Um, and I didn't really know what I wanted to study for my 4 year degree. Didn't want to spend a bunch of money while I just wasted time and figured it out. So I ended up just staying in town and helping out my old debate team and coaching. And gradually that turned into a more and more formal position. The team started doing really well. My old coaches left the team, and the person who took over didn't have any debate experience. So then I was like the debate coach. And from there, eventually, I got some work working for like debate academies, which paid me to run after school programs. And that was like 8 years ago. So I've been coaching for something like 10 years. And in that time, I've ended up coaching most events. The community college was a full service team, so I coached interp, I coached speech, and then from all of the academies, with the work I'd done with high schoolers and middle schoolers, I've coached every debate format except policy because the vibes are awful. I don't want to. So,
Fair enough.
long answer to a short question. That's who I am and how I got here.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. Congratulations to your high school. It seems like they're doing very well now. And
Yeah.
also, there's a lot of questions that I have about each of the details that you mentioned about your experience. Maybe the first and most basic question is like, I think when people say Parley, they often mean a lot of different things. For instance, like I guess I technically did parley in college as well, but certainly a different style of debate than you did. So would you mind telling us a little bit about like what kind of parley you mainly did and how it's different from other debate events?
That's such, yeah, because there's 8 different debate formats that call themselves parley. But the kind of confusing part of the answer is that there's different shades even within it based on whether where you what circuit you compete on, right? Same as LD or PF, right? So I did a format called NPDA. People who don't do NPDA call it NIPDA. I've never heard someone who does it call it that. And it has a reputation for, and on the national circuit, it is a very technical, very fast debate event. Lots of theory, critiques, and stuff like that. But what makes it really challenging is that you don't have a lot of prep time. You have like 20 minutes of prep, and you don't have like docs. So when somebody is like spreading, like you just have to listen. But that wasn't my experience with it because the community college circuit is way, way more traditional. And it doesn't exactly have lay judges because all of your judges, your least debate experienced judge, has like a master's degree and has been coaching speech and debate for a while. They just never really got into or don't really value like speed and tech and whatever. And so that was the circuit that I competed on the most. But Paul left our community college, went to University of the Pacific, where he was the top ranked. He and his partner were the top ranked team in the like fast, crazy, techie stuff for 2 years. And he came back, taught me a lot of that stuff, and the when I was coaching, my team was more involved in the sort of like techie theory type stuff. Personally, I never learned to spread. I never, you'd read topicality and stuff like that. But yeah, that's sort of like where that landed for me, somewhere between. I have a lot of interest in debate from like a design and theory standpoint. So that stuff I was always interested in, but most of my actual debating was a more traditional sort of persuasion driven format.
That makes sense. Yeah, I guess this sort of traditional versus we can call it technical for now. This divide sort of seems to exist in almost every format. Maybe less so in some like policy that are closer to the technical side. And maybe
Yeah.
there are other formats as well. Maybe like big questions or something comes to mind that's further on the traditional side. But there's still this divide all the time. It's interesting how it plays out in these different formats. I've heard people call NPDA, I'm not going to say NIPDA, NPDA. I've heard people call it like policy light because at least the technical fast version seems to mimic a lot of the same structures that we get in policy. To
Yeah.
what extent do you think that comparison is like accurate? I know light is sort of diminishing, but
I, no, no, no. I think it's completely accurate. And I think the people who say that don't realize that debate formats aren't a real determinant of what a debate is, right? Like the reason why everything becomes policy is because there's no rules stopping it. And that's what argumentation theory just does, right? If you take a debate event and you have a rule that says there's a time limit but not a word limit, and anything people don't respond to is treated as true, over a long enough time of people trying to do everything they can to win, it will all converge in a specific way. I think part of the reason why policy gets the credit for the all of these things happening in Parley and PF and LD is because policy does a lot of really great work that those other debate formats like feed off of, like take those files and those competitors become coaches in different formats and stuff like that. But ultimately, like I don't think it's inaccurate to call Parley NPDA Parley policy light, because at the national circuit there just isn't a lot of norms preventing it from being that. And I think that's the way all debate formats sort of go when there aren't norms preventing that.
That makes sense. Although I've had some discussions with other debate coaches about this recently, because I think it's a really interesting phenomenon. And I'm starting to question if this kind of policyification is really inevitable. Like, I'm completely on board with you about speed, for example. Speed seems inevitable if there's not a word cap. I'm also on board with most of these different developments that we see in policy. But I think some of them seem like pretty incidental and not inevitable. For example, policy right now has a deep lack of like non-utilitarian philosophy that shows up in very high level rounds. That doesn't seem like I don't know, like a strategic selection necessarily, but maybe more incidental to the norms of the circuit. So I'm wondering, are there any things that you think are strategic that show up often in NPDA that are not very common in policy?
Well, I can't speak to policy specifically because I haven't done a lot of policy judging and coaching, but in other formats.
Right.
Um, the answer is yes. One of the things that I think is really special about NPDA as a format is the only way to get really good, and I mean, even at the community college level, getting good at Parley is getting good at debate in general and not understanding a topic really well or having a really good case because those are different every round. And the skill you need to develop is thinking of arguments as kinds of arguments and thinking of strategies as kinds of strategies. So what'll happen at a Parley tournament is there'll be a topic, and when I was coaching it, I would be in a prep room with 10, 15, 20 kids, and you're preparing all of them at the same time, and you're developing basically an AF strategy and a neg strategy, and each team can kind of decide how they're going to use the exact specifics. But then, they all go off to their rooms and you say, good luck, have fun. And in the hallway, you catch your friend who's coaching for some other team. And one of your debaters might be debating against one of theirs. And so there's this moment where you go, what are you guys running on the app? And they're like, oh, we're running environment and whatever. What are you guys running? So we're running a counterplan. It's like, oh, okay. And like you can describe what the strategy is in one sentence.
Right.
And that's the way you start to think about debate by doing NPDA. And I see very little of that in evidentiary formats because people will think a lot about the topic and not think so much about like what is the strategy behind what I'm trying to do. And I think where that affects things the most is in like case writing. People will go on the wiki or use the brief or ask around and just sort of like collect these arguments, but there really isn't much of a strategic understanding of like what is it that I'm trying to accomplish in this round. It's a little bit like when you watch kids play soccer and everyone's running after the ball, like nobody's passing or and I mean that's I don't know. I don't mean to talk down about other debate formats, but it's not one of its the evidentiary formats that I see. That sort of strategic understanding might exist at the tippy top level, but for most debates I watch, at even I judged LD at Harvard a couple weeks ago. Like most people don't really have any sort of strategy behind what they're doing. They're just throwing out a bucket of the best arguments they could find.
Yeah, completely agree. I've seen that way too much. This is actually, I think, a perfect transition. I think most of my audience is like people who are doing PF or starting to do
Mhm.
PF. What then do you think is your best advice that you can give them to make them start having this strategy?
So, the best advice that I can give for understanding strategy and debate is to think about the debate working backwards, right? Like eventually when you're writing a case, eventually a judge is going to say, I vote for this case because. what might that sound like, right? What might be the reasons why someone votes for your argument? Universally, I would argue that is an impact, right? Well, what is it going to take for somebody to vote for that impact? The way that an impact gets voted for is either the other side has like nothing to weigh against it, or completely dropped it and it's some massive impact, or the judge is able to compare that impact to your opponent's impacts and say, this is more important. So those are the things that you should be thinking about as you're preparing, right? Like, what are the impacts that I'm going for, and how would a judge justify why it's the most important impact? And if you can bake that into the case, I think debaters are usually not experienced enough or not focusing enough on. It used to be that public forum was the debate format where all you did was talk about impact. And when I like looked at like people talking about it online, and maybe this is true of like your era of public forum, everything was about like weighing and meta weighing and like how do and that used to be all you heard about. And the sort of like policyification of public forum has moved it away from that a little bit. But that is still at the core of what public forum is. And I think a large part of that is the way public forum is designed. There's not a lot else you could do. Like, especially when you used to be able to like paraphrase evidence, like how, and you still kind of can, but people are more, railing against that. Like, what are you really going to say against the like evidence that you're not able to see, right? So most of the clash in public forum comes from these impact clashes. And the only other tip that I would add just universally is related to that. There is so much stuff in people's cases when they're beginners and intermediate that it'll get completely dropped and the debater still won't use it in any way. And the reason why is because it was never really doing anything. It was just there, right? Like, why do people read definitions, right? If I can completely concede something and it doesn't move you any closer to winning the debate round, that argument was probably not worth spending your time on in the first place. So I think looking out for like, what would it mean for me to win the debate, and how is this specific thing that I'm saying right now creating utility towards that is the most impactful way of, I think, improving in public forum.
100%, dude. You're speaking my language. I think as I'm listening to this, I'm starting to understand, like, wow, a lot of my perspective on debate probably came in some way from you. But yeah, just to add a little bit to this, like, I think this is so true, and it's true in the details as well. Like, I think people underestimate how much this should actually change the way that you debate and the way that you prep. I think one way, like an aha moment that I had when I started getting better at debate is to start to apply this logic to like literally everything. Like every word, every sentence, even in your case, should have some clear purpose that could make the difference between winning and losing at the end of the debate. And if that's not true, then like, why is it there? We talk about this in the context of time sucks, like entire contentions that are just throwaway that you don't know what to do with if it's conceded. But it's true as well for like individual pieces of the argument. And I think when you start to think of it this way, you start to actually ask important questions like, what is this doing for me? And how can I actually maximize like the content density of my speech, not just like the amount of words or the amount of arguments that I'm saying, but like the density of things that could actually help me win.
And the thing that'll raise you there is that a lot of times people are looking at a finished case and looking at a sentence and thinking, what is this doing for me? But further on the like what the Parley background taught me is I don't start with a finished case and think about what is this sentence doing. I think I need a sentence that does this.
Mhm.
So if you look at some of our videos on like advantage structure, the way we write arguments in Parley is I need a uniqueness point that says the status quo is bad right now. I need a uniqueness point that says the status quo is getting worse. And I need a uniqueness point that says that there is precedence for this thing having addressed it in the past. And I know what each of those things are supposed to do. And I know if any of those get conceded, how I use them. I now have to just go out and find the actual content. But when I'm writing a case, I know I want a sentence that does this. And you end up just with less fluff anyway because you're starting with strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think you're spot on again. A lot of the PFers that I see nowadays, they sort of like write the case and then ask questions after. Like a lot of people are just writing words so that they have enough words to make it look like their contention is valid. But they're not really adding actual like new content that is transformative in any way. It's all just like fluff, like you said. And then maybe they trim it away at the end, but it's probably much more efficient if you go into the case writing and into the prep in every part of the debate, like into your block file prep, for example, thinking not just how can this fulfill the role of this speech, but how can this win at the end? I think this is also like people don't think about this in the context of blocks very much either. And my rebuttals improved dramatically when I started taking this approach. Like it used to be probably for the first like 3 years of my debate career. I was just giving rebuttals that I thought were like good rebuttals because they, beat all of the arguments the other side had. But even if you do that, like you have to ask yourself why you're doing that. If you're spending time beating an argument that won't win them the round, like technically that's actually sort of a waste of time if you're actually thinking about it from the standpoint of like amount of time allocated to something that will help determine the outcome of the round. And so thinking about each of the speeches, not just as its own isolated speech, but in the context of the broader structure of the round, I think is very helpful.
You see this happen a lot. When I first started coaching, like I was sort of just peer coaching Paul and a couple other kids on the team. One of those kids was, I mean, he was in his early 20s, right? But one of these kids was this guy named Bradley, who loved history and is just like a geopolitics savant. So we'd be in the prep room, and he would just, from memory, start drawing a map of the world because he just knows all the borders, right? And the issue that Bradley had that made this really clear for me very early on is he would go into a debate and he would be like, they are wrong about everything they just said about the Yemen or Kazakhstan or South Korea or whatever. And he would recite a thesis on all of the facts that the opponent got wrong, and then he would lose because it's not a contest to see who knows the most about Yemen, right? It's about like what is the function of these arguments, and like okay, I might not know the president of Yemen's name, and I might not understand the history and name like said something wrong about this region, but like I've still demonstrated that like ending arms trades would do this, right? Like so I'm gonna win. So I think that speaks to what you're saying, where you can have a lot to say, but not necessarily get a lot of function out of that.
Right, exactly. So I think maybe this is one of them that I'm hearing from you already. But the next question I wanted to ask you is like, what are your biggest hot takes about debate and maybe more specifically about PF?
I have so many hot takes about debate. That's all I have. So this was like my coaching to begin with, right? Because I didn't have the, national success that Paul had or that you've had, right? What I've had is people listen to me in debate and then go have a bunch of success and then say, you know what, you're absolutely right about that. And so all I have is hot takes. Um, my my biggest PF hot take is that counterplans are allowed and people should be using them.
Ooh, this is an
Uh,
interesting one. Okay, yeah.
say that plans and counterplans are not allowed. And then they specify what that means. And it says that uh, the neither the affirmative or the negative is allowed to have like a specific plan of action, but both the affirmative and the negative are allowed to broadly advocate for things. So essentially, in public forum, in the rules, and this is by the intent of how it was designed and the reason why the neg can go first in public forum, the neg doesn't have to defend the status quo. They have literally equal right to advocate for things as the affirmative, right? It just has to be in not the same direction as the affirmative, probably, right? But I think so much of public forum instruction has come from people who did other formats of debate where the negative does have to defend the status quo, that you never really saw that be used strategically. It was either just very early on where it was still sort of like the CNN crossfire type show, and one person would say this, the other person would say that. But then the more it sort of got debatified, it brought in this stuff from other debate formats where the negative needs to defend the status quo or run a counter plan, and the rule says no counter plans. But if you actually look at the text of it, the negation can come up and say whatever they want to advocate for doing it instead. There isn't a rule against it. Now, I don't know if that's going to help you if all of your judges think that that's not allowed, but that's been the hill I've been dying on with public forum for 8 years. I've been looking at the rules and I'm like, nothing in this prevents you from actually advocating for something, which I think is a huge strategic advantage for the negation that no one's using.
This is okay. This is really funny to me. I'm sitting here laughing because I actually made two videos about exactly what you're talking about, like going through and reading the rules and finding this part. I think it says like you're allowed a general practical solution or something that you can propose. A lot of people said like, "Oh, this is nonsense," like this is not actually like a real thing, or it's completely unfair, or it doesn't make any sense. And I think to some extent it doesn't make sense, but only because the reading of the rules is weird. Like it's very unclear what a general practical solution is if not a plan or a counter plan. But I think the other complaints are sort of like I'm on your side here. I think that there's something here that can be exploited strategically that we're not tapping into enough.
I think when you look at the intent that they had for public forum, it makes more sense. Like, does it make sense from a regular strategic debate standpoint? No, it completely breaks the game. But what they wanted public forum to be was, here's a topic. We're going to have two pundits go on TV and talk about the different sides of it, right? And the reason why the negation can go first is because there isn't supposed to be like the negation is responding to the affirmative. And there isn't supposed to be things like uh, uh, wow, why am I blanking on this? I should have had breakfast before we did this. Um, uh, oh my, presumption. There we go.
Presumption.
As a presumption, right? In normal debate formats, the negation is winning by default, unless the affirmative can prove that they do, right? But in public forum, like it's just two sides on an issue, right? Like if you're talking about like the election and you're talking about like Kamala Harris or Trump, like there isn't like a default side that the presumption's for, and that's what public forum was sort of like based around, this sort of like CNN crossfire, like pro-choice or pro-life, 1 2 3 go up and say something, right? It's not really based around here is a policy action, do we take it or not. It's more like here's two sides of an issue, go up and say something. So I think that's why the rule was written that way. And now the topics are written differently than they used to be. So they are this sort of like, do we take the action or not? But anyway, I think that's how we ended up there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So I guess you would also say there's no like, no neg presumption in public forum as a result of this.
I mean, if like these questions are separate from how I actually judge a round,
Mhm.
right? Like if I'm in a round and the debaters are having a normal public forum round, then I judge it the way that I think, we're all treating the round. But I think if we're talking about like it, whether there is room for this stuff and like what the rules themselves specifically say, yeah, no, I definitely don't understand the logic behind how presumption in public forum works, given that the negative doesn't have to defend the whatever. Yeah, and the negative can go first. Like, how can anyway?
Yeah, that makes sense. One last question on this, because I do think this is like an important conversation to have. I'm glad I finally have someone who like is like, in agreement with me. That's exciting. How do you think one would pull this off? Like if I was a PFer and I want to make use of this general practical solution like loophole in the rules, um, obviously one, you already alluded to this, but it might be an uphill battle convincing judges. So how might I try to do that? And two, like how do you avoid the opponent saying like, "Oh, that's just a counter plan," like stop breaking the rules.
The specific thing is that the rules say there's no plans or counterplans, right? I think the thing that you have to draw is a parallel between the neg advocacy and the ath advocacy, right? Like you said, this rule about like a generalized whatever is kind of vague, but I think the point is that the rules say there's equal access to advocacy past the status quo. And uh, what I would do as the neg is just draw like how is my advocacy more specific or less general than your advocacy, right? That's what I would do. And it's hard to say specifically what and when, uh, what to say and when to say it without a specific topic in mind. But generally speaking, you use counterplans strategically when you have a really hard time defending the status quo.
Mhm.
Like the topic is like something to decrease prison overpopulation. Like, what are you going to go up there and say? Like, prison overpopulation is good, right? So you're forced in some way strategically to come up with something else. And I think in those situations, let's say it's uh, the topic is like abolish prisons or something like that. That's a little extreme and not necessarily one that you would need a counterplan for, but let's say it was, and you know for a fact that you can't win the debate by just saying things are good right now, keep it this way. I would have some sort of reform strategy or delay strategy or something like that. And when someone inevitably calls that a counterplan, try to say literally the rules say that if you can say we abolish prisons, I can say that we reform them. But
Yeah.
again, you'd have to have a judge that's receptive to that. And it sounds like you've had a similar experience that most people haven't read the rules. I actually saw your video about going through the rules and stuff because that's the first thing I did with public forum because I wasn't taught it as a competitor. I don't sit down with my competitors and teach them the rules, but I came in from the outside and I looked at the rules first and then I looked at how people are debating and I was like, well, that doesn't really match what you could be doing here. And yeah, most people haven't read the rules for their debate formats.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of surreal. It's weird. So I think maybe we can come back to this when I talk to you about the April PF topic. Maybe we can parse out if there is any
Yeah,
potential room for this strategy there.
sure.
But for
Um,
now, finishing up like part one of this interview, I've got two last questions for you that I think are pretty interesting. First one, you've been running this channel Proteus Debate for a while. In my experience running my own channel, I feel like for every video I release, there's like 5 or 10 videos that I like want to make but never actually do. What are some videos that you have been playing with in your head, but you haven't had the time or the energy to make?
so, I mean, you're asking this at a time where I don't think we've posted any videos in like months, and I don't think
Fair enough.
I've posted a video in like 6 or 7 months, right? So that's a very real thing. The channel started as me and Paul. We've now brought in Tanya, who's a former
Mhm.
student of ours, and an incredible debater. But the three of us are just living a life and occasionally find the time to make this stuff. Um, so there hasn't been a ton of time that I've put into it, and the best ideas that I have had have been the ones that I have not made. Because what always happens with me is if it's like, and that's why I stopped doing video editing for our videos also. It's just I knew the longer it took to make something, the more I was going to put it off. But but I'll have a lot of ideas that make me think like, okay, this deserves a very involved um, thing and a big examination, and I want to interview people and I want to talk to people, and I just haven't gotten around to them. So off the top of my head, here's maybe like the big three that still haunt me.
Sure.
I, for years, have wanted to talk to people on the topic writing committees for PF, for any NSDA event, but especially PF. This year, I had two or three people who are on that committee agree to do an interview on the channel, and I have so many questions. Um, well, part of it is I want to highlight that this is like a thankless job, and that it's really difficult to do, especially under the like circumstances that you have to write them in. Like imagine like you're in a room, there's a topic, and you have 15 minutes to discuss what this topic is. And after you're done, eventually one entire nation of people are going to be researching this thing and finding all these things you didn't think about. Like that's really difficult.
And actually, more than one nation now. Like there are NSTA qualifiers here in Taiwan. We use the same US topics too. So you influence the world.
Yeah, yeah. No, totally, right? It's really difficult. Um, and the other reason I want to ask is because, even I've had many topics where I was like, come on. Like what? So that's one that I want to do. Another one is I have this like 50, 60 slide thing finished on just like competitiveness in debate and its role. I know we talk a lot among coaches about like the role of competition. And a lot of times when people are talking about ways they want to reform debate, they talk about like, well, why does it have to be zero sum? Can we have a format of debate that is more about like collaboration? And I sort of just want to explore like what competitiveness itself adds to debate and its role. And it's a big topic that I have a lot of thoughts on, and so I've never finished it. And then there's a million round analysis videos that people have asked us to do. And I always feel like by the time I'm sitting down and being like, you know what, I have the time. It's like, oh, somebody requested that 2 years ago. They probably graduated. So I always feel bad about those.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I feel that so hard. I think I have a note stock that's like 30 different videos that I've been meaning to record. The competitiveness one.
Making these, right? Because the demand is so much higher than any one person can make in their free time. But I think you were starting to say a video you wanted to make.
The competition one you mentioned, that sounds like awesome. Like I've been thinking about a similar thing as well because I think these conversations naturally come up when you're a coach. Like you start thinking about why you do debate and what makes it valuable. And inevitably the point everyone makes is like, oh, it's not all about winning and losing, but then it's like a little bit about winning and losing. That's like a part of it. So it's an interesting discussion to have. I think it's very necessary.
A quick tangent. So the community college national championship is 6 days of competition. The reason why it's so long is because it's a full service tournament and you can enter in 4 events. So like when I'm talking about like Tanya, she was a Parley debater and an LD debater, but she also had a platform speech and did interp and was like gold level at all of them, right? She was so good. And so you can't run any of these events at the same time. So you have to have everything in its own time block, and that makes the tournament really, really long. It's still like six prelims, and there's only two elim rounds, right? But because you're trying to run everything at the same time, it's a 6 day long tournament. So when coaches or in a school is sort of taking on the duty of hosting that tournament, a lot of what they have to do is plan events for evenings and during the days for the second half of the week. Because the competition will start on, let's say, Monday. By Thursday, it'll start on Monday, uh, and then on Saturday, it's over, something like that. Maybe that's 5 days, but Sunday, I guess it's over. Doesn't matter. But by Thursday, most of the people who flew across the country and are staying in this hotel are no longer competing. Just statistically speaking, right? You're now in out rounds. And then half of those people, by the time it's Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you have fewer and fewer people with anything to do. So most of the actual logistical planning for the itinerary is, what do we do with and provide for the students who aren't winning? And I think this is a big question that we should be asking ourselves in forensics a lot more broadly speaking, right? Most kids don't get to go to the TOC. Most kids at a tournament don't get to finals. I think it's good that it's common practice in debate to have the awards like sometime around octos, and then we'll hand you your award or whatever later. But like, we're going to get everybody out of here sooner than that. And yeah, I think to your point, there's most people who do this activity won't get to win a tournament. And to me, that says that there needs to be a bigger point to this activity, and a way where you get the thing that matters about this activity that doesn't require winning a tournament in order for it to be worth it. Because
Yeah.
people are going to get to do that statistically.
Yeah. And you know what? That is a perfect transition to the last question that I will ask you before we talk about nuclear energy, which is, what do you think is that other thing beyond winning and losing? Like maybe it's a number of different things. What makes debate meaningful to you?
Um, yeah, that's a great question. There's a couple things. I guess I'll focus on the two biggest ones. Um, I was recently, I'm just as of recently no longer working with them, but I was working for this organization in New York called the Brooklyn Debate League. They're still around, they're great. And it was co-founded by my old boss, Deco. And Deco went to a high school in Lower Manhattan called Stuyvesant. This is kind of a heavy story.
I think I've heard about this, but yeah, continue.
Yeah, Deco was a junior in high school when the September 11th attack happened. And I went to Stuyvesant and I like coached LD there for a couple days. And it's just a giant building with glass windows, like 4 blocks away from the World Trade Center. It's like horrific to imagine that, right? But Deco basically spent the rest of that, well, came back from that experience and was trying to talk about what had happened. And as you can imagine, like everyone is very traumatized and no one wants to talk about anything. And what drew them to extemp and forensics in general was just that it was this place that you got to talk about things and people would listen to you. And that was my experience with debate. What made me stick around and get the most out of it was partly what I'm going to talk about in a second, but also just the feeling of like the world owing me an explanation. Like, you can vote me down, but you have to explain why I'm wrong. And that's a really powerful experience for people to have that platform. And I think it's why the Brooklyn Debate League exists, because people who go to high schools that don't have a lot of money deserve that platform too, and it's a very powerful thing. The second aspect of what I think is really valuable about debate is ultimately, I think debate comes down to decision making, which is what I think all of ethics is, right? I think ethics is the answer to the question, which decision should we make? And I think exercising decision making in all of the forms that we do in debate is a really valuable way of thinking about choices and potential consequences. And I don't think the topic is as important as the systems you develop for how you approach major decisions and how you process the arguments from the other side and think about stuff like that. So I think those are the most valuable things in debate. Um, there probably is some way that we can do that that looks a little bit different or is a little less competition focused, but I like competition, and I think competition is important in ways that would take me an hour to describe. But part of it for me is that like once you get bit by the bug and you're just working really hard to try to win, you're looking at things in ways you wouldn't have looked at them before,
Mhm.
and you're pushing yourself harder than you would have pushed yourself before. And I think having that sort of drive be focused in on this thing that's ostensibly about critical thinking and decision making is a really valuable aspect of debate that hopefully everybody who does this activity gets a little bit of.
Yeah, 100%. Dude, debate is so cool. I'm glad that I'm able to talk with you about this stuff. I think like all of these conversations that there are a few different ways that you can take them as like conclusions. Like one is like maybe there is room for us to change debate in some way, to reform it in some way. But two, I think also is just like we should be thinking about this more when we're doing debate. Like a lot of high school debaters, I think they don't think very much about why it's meaningful to them. Like they get bit by the bug and then they chase after the wins and then like only after they're done, maybe like uh if ever, then they start thinking like, why did I spend so much time on this? Like I guess it was fun, but like really why?
I know you want to talk about nuclear energy, but I have a couple thoughts on that. I think I know why. Um, well, at least I have some things to say on it. Part of it's different on the college circuit. Um, you have a lot more people aware of why they're doing it and what they're enjoying about it. Partly that's because they're older. Partly because there's no there's less parental pressure, there's less social pressure, and there's less like reward. There's less incentive. You don't get anything for winning a national championship in debate because you're already in college, right? Like you're not gonna like maybe it'll. I mean, that's not entirely true. If you do really well in college debate, you can become a grad assistant somewhere. That's what Paul did, and he got his master's degree paid for, and he got paid to coach debate. Um, which is amazing, right? He was the first member of his family to go to college. So the fact that he got a master's degree paid for and whatever, that's not nothing. But generally speaking, there's a huge incentive to do debate because it looks good on a college application, which I think sort of clouds a lot of this other stuff. The other thing that I think affects people's relationship to uh, debate is, through the channel, a lot of the audience for my debate channel is people who don't have their own debate team or don't have an experienced coach. So obviously, I've interacted with a lot of people from that background, but especially like living in New York now and doing some work with these massive schools like Bronx Science and Stuyvesant and in on the West Coast, knowing some people who worked with James Logan High School, just these really really big programs. Um, the the vibes on some of these teams as a new competitor can be really really awful. There is this sort of I mean, I don't know. You see it every now and then on some post on Reddit, right? But it's just a very toxic, internally competitive environment, and people are competing for these like leadership roles. And when they have it, they treat people badly. And I think that goes, it factors a lot into people's experience with debate and not really getting to appreciate the good things because on a given trip, right? You're not just like mainly experiencing, oh, I got to do some critical thinking today. You're mainly experiencing some awful vibe on the bus, right? So I think that plays a role in it. And I think the more we can do to address that stuff, the better we'll accomplish our sort of loftier goals.
Yeah, 100%. Okay. It's nuclear energy time, I think. So we will transition into part two of the interview. So we have a topic officially now. It has been voted on, and I'm happy to say that we predicted it correctly. The topic officially is resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase its investment in domestic nuclear energy. So my first question for you is like, let's pretend that you are about to prepare for a tournament in April in PF. You're sitting down, you're getting ready to prep. What are the first things that you do? What's your game plan?
This is so Paul and I have talked about just a lot of debate topics. We've had to write a lot of topics for tournaments, and partly you're constantly writing topics, and we've coached, you know, all sorts of different events and for different reasons, Congress bills, stuff like that. And I think we're in agreement that nuclear energy is like the GOAT. It's like the all time greatest debate topic. It has been around forever. It's always going to be around because the US isn't ever going to do anything about it. And it just has the best balance of like the status quo is bad. We're trying to do something. That thing has positives and negatives and significant impacts environmentally, politically, military wise, economically. So it's, I think, the best topic. I think it might not be your favorite topic, but I think as far as a topic that lets debate shine and do all the cool debate stuff, like I think nuclear energy is the best one. Um, so how would I approach this topic? My approach to debate, especially more recently, is when we're talking about like working backwards from the finish, right? That means some impact you had won the round. I have talked to Paul about this also, and I believe that there are 7 impacts that are. I wish I had a less embarrassing analogy, but did you know much about Super Smash Brothers?
A tiny bit, yeah.
So in Super Smash Brothers, like Melee, it's like one of the games that people play the most and have the most competitive scene. There was a time where there were these 5 people who were called like the 5 gods of Melee, right? And
Right.
they were called that because basically they would only lose to each other.
Hmm.
Like anyone that's not in this top 5 will lose to the top 5. They can beat anyone that isn't in that top 5. And then, you know, between them, there's strengths and weaknesses and whatever. I think there are 7 impacts that essentially have that in debate, that they will only lose to each other. They will never lose to an impact that isn't in this list. Um, they are, off the top of my head, uh, war, economic collapse, environmental collapse, public health. It's not 7, it's 5, I think. War, economic collapse, environmental collapse, public health, and poverty, which is kind of like economic collapse, but a little different. And the like all of these are basically where you get your terminalized impacts. So if you're talking about extinction or whatever, like that's going to come from one of these 5 things, or any major impact you're talking about is going to come from one of these things. And if your impact is something like education or something like that, the way you're going to have to explain why education is important is ultimately going to tie into its effects on poverty, its effects on public health, its effects on whatever, right? So, what I do is I take a look at these five impacts and I look for connections to the topic for the ath, to the neg, and try to mix up like having two contentions for, one for each of them. Depending on the topic, I might not be able to get there. So, off the bat, the obvious ones for the affirmative are environmental uh, impacts. That's huge. So the status quo is not going well. It's going okay. There's actually more recent evidence that says like our worst case scenarios for the environment are being, kind of assuaged, but that's why in Parley, when we're talking about the uniqueness, we have this argument that says the status quo is about to get worse. And I think with Trump administration stuff, you can always make the argument that all this stuff is going to get rolled back. Germany is getting more conservative, and who knows how long these EU whatever are going to last. I think you can always argue that there's an urgent need for cleaner energy infrastructure and the impacts from that. I think there are definitely some public health arguments. Not every argument needs to be this like massive extinction level thing, especially if you just really cleanly get to an impact. I think the last time I looked this up was probably 5 years ago, but these things like just stick in your head for whatever reason. When I was looking it up, like how many people in the United States die a year from preventable air pollution? Like, in other words, if we got the air cleaner, how many lives would we save a year? And that number off the top of my head was 70,000, which is a lot of people, right? Look into that. Don't just like cite the transcript of this as your card. But I think there's definitely that. And I think there is probably some economic stuff that you can talk about for why like a economic dependence on fossil fuels isn't great, right? Like there's a reason why Norway, for instance, has one of the world's largest reserves of fossil fuels and uses basically none of it, just sells all of it off because you can't become economically dependent on a depleting resource. So I think those are the strong arguments on the affirmative. On the neg, I think there's definite econ arguments to be made about like the immediate cost of building stuff and investing in these things. I think the most interesting arguments and the ones that like people should be making a lot on the neg is the military aspects of it, that essentially like uranium is uranium. Like you have to enrich it more for it to be, used in a nuclear weapon or something like that. But if somebody like, knock on wood, like crashes a plane into a nuclear facility, like that is just killing everybody in that city. Like there's nothing they can really do to stop that. And there have been a lot of like even just natural disaster problems with nuclear energy, and just like just because the Fukushima like wasn't the worst thing that's ever happened in the world, it doesn't like necessarily mean that these things are super safe. I know there's some like new thorium reactors and they have this or whatever, but it's still like from a security standpoint, it is just inherently increasing the amount of dangerous stuff that there is. And I think it's also worth noting that I watched this video earlier today on my phone about there's a freeway in New York City called the BQE that connects Queens and Brooklyn, and it's like a 6-lane highway that runs through the middle of the city. And it goes through this kind of bougie neighborhood called Brooklyn Heights. And they didn't want a 6-lane highway. So the solution they found was literally like stacking part of the highway on top of itself. So it's kind of like a two-tier highway. And this video was about how every engineer is confident that this road is going to collapse sometime in the next 10 years. Like it just will. It is going to collapse. And no one has any solution for that. The only solutions that might work basically involve building a 6-lane highway through this bougie neighborhood that people don't want. And I think one that speaks to sort of like inevitability on a long enough time scale of accidents and problems happening, but also like there's a lot of societal issues around nuclear energy because there are going to be the need to be places that get used for building these things and disposing of the waste, and they're not going to be where rich people live. And to whatever degree there is sort of health side effects of that, there is a lot of inequity in how that gets distributed out to people, and to whatever degree people want to talk about like critical literature around that stuff, like that is, I think, fertile ground for that sort of thing. With that having been said, I think the neg probably needs to focus on advantages of renewables over. I don't think you're really going to win based on fossil fuels. So the nuclear energy debate really isn't about like what's better, like thorium power plants or oil. Really, it's about what's better, thorium power plants or renewables. And the answer is nuclear energy. But the neg needs to be talking about like stuff that we don't have yet or just sort of on the cusp of having. And the advantage you have over that is that like we don't have these nuclear power plants now and they take a lot of time to build. So if your technology is not going to exist for 5 years, that's probably fine because these power plants take like 7 years to build anyway. Check all of these facts and figures. This is just my memory of having talked about this debate many times over the years, right? So I think if you can find a more exciting sort of alternative that you think we should be putting our investment in instead, you kind of have the counterplan route of saying like, let's do this instead, or you have the like this pulls investment from these things. But you functionally treat it like a counterplan where any disadvantage to nuclear energy becomes a reason to prefer renewables, right? Because renewables still resolve for the same environmental stuff. In other words, I don't think you're ever going to have an reason to be like excited for what nuclear energy is. You're just excited about what it isn't. It doesn't pollute, it doesn't have whatever, but I don't think there's any like inherent great thing about like using uranium and thorium and having it around for 1,000,000 years afterward. So it's just a question of whether the neg can find a more exciting solution for the same thing, and the clash that kind of comes out of weighing those options and investment, and is this there's lots of other problems with there's a lot of problem with hydroelectric dams, for instance, that I think the AF needs to talk about, and their environmental impact on like fish and other stuff like that. There's lots of problems with wind and how that affects, I don't know, like birds flying into them and stuff like that. Like I think the more interesting layer of this debate is underneath the fossil fuel debate, where I think that's going to be kind of interesting and kind of have some stuff there. But I think once you get below that, really the debate isn't like, is nuclear energy better than fossil fuels? It is. The more interesting debate is nuclear energy still the most exciting sort of green uh, energy option we have. And I think that's what's going to make for a more nuanced and interesting debate.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think this framing of the topic around like what the energy isn't is probably going to stand true for almost every argument I can think of. I think it's a good way to think about it. So I guess it seems like there are almost two debates that are happening at once under the way that you're thinking about it. Like one debate is that the AF and the neg will be fighting this sort of tug of war to determine what the neg's ground is vis-a-vis the energy that is being replaced by nuclear energy. And that will take a lot of forms. The neg will have arguments that we are moving toward this other new renewable energy now, and that you suck investment away from that. But that's sort of, I think that's maybe people will have cards that say this, but that seems like a difficult route to take. Which means that maybe this kind of counterplans type general solution that we're talking about earlier might also be a good option that can sort of be layered on top of that. Like it's a general solution that we should just invest more in this general renewable technology that could be better instead of using those funds for investing in nuclear energy. But then there's this interesting thing that happens in that debate as well, where like, what if it's both? Like, what if the AF wins some of that and the neg wins some of that? The tug of war kind of ends up in the middle. And at the end of the debate, the judge thinks that nuclear energy will replace some mix of good renewables and bad fossil fuels. Um, and I feel like my intuition says that the AF usually wins that because we're avoiding bad things instead of getting good things.
Yeah. So to speak to that, yes, the first layer of the debate and the first one layer of all debates is the desirability of the status quo, right? Like because if the neg can't defend the status quo at all, or maybe even just like you were saying, the directionality of it, right? Like where is the status quo going if we don't do this? If you can't defend that at all, then you end up with what on the affirmative we call try or die, which is this is already the worst case scenario. It doesn't matter if there's a 1% chance that we're going to uh, succeed, it's worth doing, right? If you're in a burning building on the fourth floor, it's probably going to hurt if you jump out, and the chances of success are low, but like, what else are you going to do, right? Um, so I think that's something that a lot of affirmatives get away with, and a lot of affirmatives in this debate should be trying to get away with, right? Make the status quo sound so bad that any potential pitfall with nuclear energy is still clearly worth it. I think what you're saying about the AF still doing a good thing is true and accurate, and is also like how we evaluate counterplan debate. So in counter, which is like a thing, which I think PF debaters don't learn a lot about counterplans because they think they can't use it, but you can just not call it a counterplan and it works, right? So in counterplan debate, there's this idea that the counterplan is an opportunity cost argument.
Mhm.
So that's why the negation is allowed to make an argument, because the bad thing about the AF is it's costing us an opportunity to do this thing instead. What you're describing is demonstrating that there isn't an opportunity cost, that we can invest in nuclear energy and invest in uh, this other kind of energy. And if that happens in a counterplan debate, the affirmative would win. So you're right in how that shakes out. So the strategy behind it in counterplan debates like this are what we would call a disadvantage counterplan, which is there is some disadvantage to your method of solving this problem.
Mhm.
I have a different method of solving the problem that solves the same problem the same way you solve it, but it avoids that disadvantage. And it's really important. Some people don't understand this. It's different than reading a disadvantage and a counterplan if that disadvantage also applies to your counterplan, right? What it is let's saying I 100% agree that the status quo is bad and we should do something. But if we have the option of doing this thing that costs $10 million and doing this thing that costs $9.5 million, let's do the $9.5 million one, right? So any disadvantage to the affirmative, as long as the negative can solve all the same stuff just as well, becomes a reason to vote negative. So at that point, really the strategy behind that is, okay, I have these problems with nuclear energy, like its potential like risk, the way it affects certain communities, its cost, whatever, right? um, but none of those are going to win me a debate on their own. So what really the strategy here is you're reading this renewable argument so that the flaws with nuclear energy have enough teeth in them to win you the debate, because they wouldn't overcome fossil fuel dependence and pollution and all that stuff on their own. But if you could show that the status quo is trending away from that stuff anyway, or you could advocate for increasing more in renewables instead, yes, we could have nuclear energy and this other stuff, but then we would also have major targets for espionage and terrorist attacks and a bunch of nuclear waste to deal with and getting disposed in poor communities and stuff like that, right? So I think that's sort of more the nuance of how you try to approach this question of, well, the AF is doing a good thing, so they should win, is more that like, well, the AF's not doing a good thing because they're making the world net worse than it would be if they did nothing, or if they invested in nuclear energy instead.
Right, that makes sense. I feel like strategically knowing this, I think you can also prepare for that on the AF. Like lean into the fact that like the fossil fuel dependence argument, you're almost guaranteed to win if you play your cards right. If that is true, if that's the comparison at the end, you have a very good path to victory. And so you can almost treat that like a nib, like a burden on the neg, like a gateway issue. The first thing they have to do to even enter this round and stand a chance is prove that we're not comparing nuclear energy and fossil fuels. And then we can still beat them on their ground on renewable energy. So we have like two paths that are independent to win. They can only win if they prove both of these are true. And setting up the debate that way, I think, is quite strategic.
I 100% agree with you. And I think that's where the nuance between like the status quo is going this way, or like
Mhm.
my advocacy is that we do this. I think that's where that nuance is actually going to matter the most.
Yeah,
And I think that's where the nuclear energy debate right now, this month in March 2025, is it the April topic? In
I guess
April
so, yeah.
2025 is going to look different than it would have in April 2022, because and that's kind of what's like interesting about these sort of like evergreen topics, is you're never really having the same debate, because right now who knows what's going on with Trump. So if we were having this debate 6 months ago, the cards would talk about how actually all of the major U.S. And like BP, Exxon Mobil, and BP and whatever, they're all investing really heavily into transitioning to renewables. That's what we would have been talking about 6 months ago. Some headline that I read the other day said that I don't remember which oil company now has like completely ended its investment in renewables, probably because of the Trump administration, right? Um, you have stuff like what's going, like Europe was really invested in moving away from oil because it was dependent on Russia for its oil. But what's going to happen in Ukraine with Russia, and if they have a peace agreement or something like that, is Europe still going to not accept Russian petroleum? And what's going to happen to investments into renewables as a result of that? Um, Germany is becoming more conservative, right? And they are like basically the backbone of the EU and a major part of where a lot of this sort of like shift to renewables is coming from. What does that look like in a few years? So I think there's a lot to call into question what would have been a given 6 months ago that um, that the shift to green energy is happening and will go well.
Okay, given all of this, and you mentioned this a little bit already, what do you think are the best arguments on the neg? Because I think that from my perspective, this seems like we've been talking a lot about some good AF arguments. I know that the neg has a good winning shot if you talk about like the counterplan strategy, like we should invest more in renewables. What do you think are the best disadvantages to tag on to that as well?
I think you need to have some sort of just existential risk of from doing this. I don't necessarily advocate for like making every debate about extinction or anything like that, but the point is that like you need to talk about what the biggest risk that this affirmative poses is, and that is nuclear, like just nuclear stuff, right? Which is really, really dangerous, and it's really, really dangerous forever. And even if nothing goes wrong, it affects, like people in like native reservations and stuff like that, right? But if something does go wrong, it has catastrophic um, damage that can't can't be addressed. There's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do, right? Like if something happens with one of these nuclear power plants and something goes wrong or there's sabotage or there's something, like I don't know. I think a lot of people in debate sort of hand wave certain concerns by like saying, well, people are rational actors, so like they wouldn't do that. And like how is that true? Which of the things in the last 10 years that have happened in the world would lead you to think that like major world decisions are made by rational actors, right? Like every person who perpetrated the 9/11 attacks died in the process, right? Like are they rational actors? Because like people are like, oh well, people wouldn't do a thing that also hurts them. Yes, they would, right? Like Hamas, when the October 7th attack happens, they released a statement that they're like, we are doing this because, I mean, I don't know the exact phrasing of it, but part of it was just that like Saudi Arabia and Israel seemed like they might be coming to some sort of peace agreement, and then the sort of like plight of the Palestinian people would just not have any sort of solution to it ever. And so Hamas was like, we are starting this because we want to start like basically a never ending war. Whether they regret that or not, I don't know. But that was part of it, right? People do these things for reasons that we would not find rational. And I don't think the like people wouldn't blow up a nuclear power facility is like enough of a like hand wave, just my analytic sort of thing. How about you have a card that says people wouldn't blow that up? You're not going to find it because it is a major concern. That is like why all of these security measures are necessary. If no one would do that, oh wow, let's put these plants everywhere. So I think the negative really needs to be able to like not only explain the significance of those impacts, but also like not let the AF get away with lazy hand waving, no one would do that sort of thing. Or just like, that's not likely to happen. Like, you're building something that is going to be dangerous for tens of thousands of years, just a much longer scale than anything has gone well in humanity or that we've ever worked with, right? We can't go from one administration to another in 4 years and know what's going to happen. Like you're building this thing because you know exactly what's going to, like how well we're going to take care. Like these things require constant upkeep. You're confident that we're going to be able to do that upkeep for the next 60,000 years. So I think that's the scenario that the neg needs to go for, and that's sort of their fossil fuels bad argument. Like the affirmative gets this thing that like the environmental collapse is going to happen if we don't do something about it, uh, and that's their sort of like biggest impact. the neg has some ways around that in the debate, but if they get away with that, you're right, like that layer in the debate, they only need to talk about the other things, assuming that isn't like a given. I think for the neg, they only need to talk about their other arguments, assuming the affirmative has some argument for why nuclear energy isn't like this existentially dangerous thing.
That makes sense. So, given all of this, you are in a debate round. Your opponents win the coin flip. They pick second. What side are you picking?
The funny answer to that question is that I'm picking AF because the AF should always go first.
Right.
But no, I think in this debate, um, it's interesting. I mean, I generally like the AF better in debate because of the role that I had in debate. I liked giving the last speech, and I like being the side that's like doing something. Um, I think maybe the more interesting side for me to be on, which is like, I don't have a horse in this race anymore, right? Like, I'm not going to get a trophy. I think the more interesting side to be on in this debate is the neg,
Mhm.
because I think most AFs are going to say the same thing. I think it's really hard to have an interesting AF on this topic, because there aren't a lot of different ways of doing this. Or a whole lot of unpredictable reasons why we might do it. I think the negative is driving a lot more of where each specific debate goes, and the AF sort of has to like react to that. In other words, like I think if you're like reading, like we're talking about disclosure and you're reading cases and whatever, I think the neg cases are going to be the more interesting ones to like prepare for, because I think the AFs are going to be more or less the same, right? So in that sense, I would prefer being the neg because I would want to be driving rather than sort of reacting to what the other side chose.
That makes sense. That's cool. Well, any last thoughts before we end it? It is
My
getting a little bit late for me, so
no, so sorry. I told you we couldn't do this in an hour. Uh, uh, yeah, my thoughts are that I'm grateful you asked me to do this. I'm also grateful that you're doing this in general. I think it's a really neat idea to have a bunch of different people share different perspectives on this, and some. I hope some of them vastly disagree with mine, right? Um, I think it's great that you're also making this channel and making the videos. I think the community definitely needs it. And I'm excited for you in 5 years to hear that somebody watched some video you made in an afternoon, thought about in a long time, and like that helped them that week. So, uh, yeah, best of luck. If I can ever help with anything, let me know.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Sasan, and thank you
All
to
right.
everyone for watching this interview.